Okay, we'll go action. Hi, my name's Julian Wilson.
Hi, I'm Megan Stewart.
Hey, I'm Hayden Dyke, and today we're going to be presenting sections G through K of Figure 2 of Tang's fear learning experiment, and Julian is going to kick us off with the first figure.
Well, first off, the most important thing we have to do is recap the previous group. The figures that they went over were talking about the just some basic figures of how the electrodes were implanted into the craniums of each unit, and some basic data looking at the freezing of each unit when they were implanted with the electrode. As we see in A, that's just the simple breakdown of the 3-day process, and B through C were quickly just on where the electrode was implanted in the brain, both in a graph and a live photo form. And then D through F were all about the units and a little bit of data on their freezing.
And the main research questions and goals that this figure addresses directly are going to be if dopaminergic VTA neurons that project to the basal amygdala also respond to aversive shock cues, like the foot shock in this experiment. And further, will those VTA neurons acquire an auditory cued fear response after day 2's conditioned stimulus, unconditioned stimulus pairing?
So in order to create these figures that we're about to go over, first they had to have, first they performed surgery on the mice in order to plant an optrode recording into the VTA in their brains. This records the extracellular spikes due to the CHR2 protein that gets excited when it's exposed to light. And then they would apply the stimulus, which you can see in Figure 2A. On day 1 was habituation. They only applied a tone. On day 2 was training, where they applied a tone. And after they applied a foot shock to the mice. And then on day 3, cued retrieval, they applied only a tone again. And for the data analysis, they put the raw data through software system to get the average Z-score from the optrode. And the Z-score shows that shows the data's deviance from the mean, and it makes an effective analysis in this case because the data for mice not going through foot shock is roughly the same, and you're seeing spikes on the foot shock. So by using the Z-score, it's clear where the spikes are coming from the VTA expression. So in Figure 2G, it shows the response of all units in one mouse, and its number was FT7612. And the control you can see here in gray. If you look at the graph on the side, the control is shown in gray, and the experimental mouse, the mouse FT7612, is shown in red. And so the control mice only received CS throughout all 3 days, and the experimental mouse received foot shock on day 2. On the y-axis, we see the Z-score, which represents the optrode recording, and it's a function of the CS number and the paired CS-US presentation on the x-axis, which you can see like the number 1 and number 6. That's just how many of the stimulus they went through at that point. And so from this data, we can see that on day 2, the experimental mouse that's receiving the foot shock spikes really high right after the foot shock begins. And that's carried on into day 3, where you can see that the spikes stay high, which means that even though the mouse wasn't being foot shocked, it was remembering yesterday when it was a cue and then a foot shock. So even though it only has a Q on day 3, the VTA is still responding in the same way that it responded on day 2, showing that these mice, their VTA is not only having a fear response, but also a fear memory.
And here in Figure 2H, to investigate the role of the DAT plus neurons, the role that they have in unconditional stimulus processing, responses to foot shocks from day 2 were recorded and analyzed. And as you can see with the figure over here, though that the strength of the response varies, the majority of the units that were recorded did respond. 6 of the 8 units that were recorded responded with an increase in action potential firing. And this just suggests that that the VTA dopamine neurons encode the unconditioned stimulus representation during the fear conditioning. And this further suggests or supports the formation of fear memories from the VTA dopamine neurons.
In figure I through K, there are a couple of Venn diagrams that were showing 3 different mice. That would be unit FT7612 from before, unit FT6963, and unit FU1284. And it was an overlap of a couple of different things, but the biggest thing that the Venn diagram shows is that the responses, while sometimes different, mainly stuck in the middle. You can see that through the different color combinations that come out of it. And it was consistent not by chance, but mainly through the fact that the foot shocks, when paired with the respondent, created a reaction out of the mice. And the biggest thing to note is that most of the time it was consistent with each other throughout all 3 mice. The next big 3 things, or the next big thing though, were the criticisms we had in units. What was that? Units I through K. We only did get 3 out of the 12 mice that had that were recorded in this way. It would have been more interesting to have seen what more of the mice had. Only a quarter of the population doesn't seem like a very large sample size when all 12 mice had available data. And it's just interesting it would have been more interesting to see if all 12 mice lined up with the criteria. The other big problem was in figure 2G. There was a little bit of uncertainty on the gray lines that appeared as shown before, and we deduced that they were part of the control. However, still being unclear, it was kind of just interesting to note.
And this is obviously the only reference we used.